Speaking of supporting the podcast, I want to thank Jay Coughlin for the review on Apple Podcasts, not iTunes. What am I thinking? I'm thinking music. Apple Podcasts. It's 5 stars. What a fun way to listen to someone who has only consumed the Harry Potter books as an adult. If you're looking for sarcastic takes and fabulous puns, this is the place for you, my friends. Aloha give me mora this podcast. And this, the title of this, the headline of this review is Protego Go Listen to This podcast. So awesome use of puns. Definitely caught on to what we're doing with the segment titles with the spell puns. And I sincerely appreciate the kind words. I love reading all of these reviews. So if you'd like yours with a little shout out, please go leave one. Now, it's time for
Lumos.
Let's pull out our wands and light the tips. But we're not blowing smoke. We're here to illuminate. Well, when in doubt, Albus Dumbledore. But this time, what the hell was he thinking hiring Gilderoy Lockhart? So let's cover the quick notes that we all know by now. Dumbledore knows the DA position is cursed, and whoever he picks is going to be gone in a year. It also seems that he's been struggling to find a willing body for the role. So sure, maybe he was the only option Dumbledore had, or maybe he actually serves a purpose. Which one of those do you think we're going to talk about? For this, I'm going to give some credit to the Super Carlin brothers. Their YouTube channel for at least parts of this. That's where I heard the general nexus of this idea or thought process and kind of formulated my thoughts around it. So credit to them for that one. I know I've credited them before, and if you're listening to this, you've definitely watched some of their videos because they're kick-ass videos. And they're good at this stuff. So shout out to them. They don't know I exist. Anyways, they had a theory that part of what Dumbledore was doing, hiring Lockhart, was showing Harry what not to become with fame. And I think there's something to that. I also think, and maybe I heard this somewhere too, I mean, this fandom's been alive and well for 20 years. There's probably not an original thought to be had left. But Dumbledore may know what Lockhart's been doing. Maybe not the specifics, but that he doesn't believe the stories were actually acted out by Lockhart. And he wants to expose him as a fraud. Which would make some sense. I like to think that he doesn't know that Lockhart literally was obliviating these people, but I think he does know that. I'm gonna keep going down that rabbit hole a little bit here. At the end of this book, a line that Dumbledore says to Lockhart when he comes back with no memory because his obliviation backfired on himself is that he was impaled on his own sword. Now, of course, this could mean something, and I'm hoping that's not just a movieism, by the way, too. But I seem to remember that line, and it stuck with me when diving down this particular theory. It could obviously just mean that he tried to wipe the memories completely of these two children, and instead it backfired on him, and that would be literally impaling himself on his own spell, but the expression is impaling oneself on their own sword. So that could be all that it means. I like to think that it means a little bit more. I think it means that Dumbledore knows that he used memory modification on the wizards who actually did the things that Lockhart wrote about and took the credit for it. What I don't like to think is that Dumbledore didn't do anything about it until now. And perhaps maybe he just recently realized it. Maybe he just had some suspicions that Lockhart was full of shit, and he just recently looked into it, and through his pretty solid investigative instincts and deductive reasoning skills, came to the conclusion that he was modifying these people's memories. Now, I say modifying because I don't think that Lockhart was literally wiping the memories of the people whose stories he was, or acts of greatness that he was stealing. I think he was just adjusting them so that they wouldn't call him out for taking credit for their achievements. I think, either they forget the details of what went down, or he inserts himself into it so that they remember the whole thing, but as like witnessing him do it versus them being the ones to do it themselves. Something like that. Because I personally think that if he was literally wiping these people's memories and they were coming out of it like he does in this instance, I think that would actually have drawn more attention to the fact that something hinky was going on. Like, more people showing up at St. Mungo's with just no memory of what's happening, immediately correlating to his fame and success continuing to rise. Like, that probably leaves more opportunity for people to go digging than just kind of implanting a small adjustment to their memory so that it's almost undetectable that he's full of shit. That's my personal headcanon. That's my theory on the matter. And that's what I think Dumbledore was trying to expose him of. I think that if he was literally wiping these people's memories clean too, this wouldn't be the way that Dumbledore chose to expose him. I think he would have done something a little bit more direct, and perhaps something with a little bit more immediate impact. So that being said, why is this the way that he went? And by this the way that he went, I think that Dumbledore is trying to get him to expose himself as a fraud in this teaching position specifically. So why that? Why as a teacher and not try to do some grandiose act where he's, I don't know, put him on the spot in front of a group of his closest supporters or whatever. I don't know. Well, for starters, I think, one, Dumbledore doesn't really care about fame and popularity at this point in his life. So I think he kind of doesn't give a shit that Lockhart is getting famous necessarily. I think he gives a shit about him being a fraud and doing it fraudulently, and by taking credit for others' actions that annoys him. And I think that to him, what's most important is the students of Hogwarts. He wants them to learn that this famous person who claimed credit for acts that he didn't commit was actually full of shit. This could actually, arguably anyways, have a greater impact than calling him out in front of his supporters, say, for instance, or bringing him up, trying to prove it in a court of law or whatever, to whatever extent that actually exists in this wizarding world, because that's a whole can of worms we're going to get into later in the series, and actually some later in this book, but cart before the horse. I think part of it is about not just getting them to go home and tell their parents that this dude that they're reading about and their parents is probably a fan of is completely full of shit, but even more than that, they get to see what happens to someone who lies for their own gain, who takes credit for others' work and what can happen if that backfires. And again, like Harry, what he doesn't want them as children to become. They're children, remember? And the purpose of school for children is to mold children to be productive members of magical society, not lying, conniving piles of shit. Ultimately, this comes back to the greater good for Dumbledore. He wants these students to learn that they should be working for the betterment of that magical society, not just for yourself. Value and prioritize the greater good. Let's do some
Divination.
It's time to highlight 4 moments in the chapter that foreshadow something to come in the future. 1. Meeting Justin Finch Fletchley and Colin Creevy too, but we're going to put a spotlight on Justin because he's more of a spotlight of the plot. But in both cases, Muggleborns. New Muggleborn characters. And it's a seed planted for later in this book. Once the Chamber of Secrets has been opened, these are 2 of the students who get petrified, and Justin Finch Fletchley in particular. That petrification causes Harry a lot of headache at school. 2, I'm actually going to bring Colin Creevy back for this one, because he doesn't get the same drama surrounding his petrification, but if I remember right, wasn't he petrified while trying to sneak to the hospital wing to see Harry when he came across the basilisk in his camera? So if that's the case, isn't that kind of a foreshadow to him later sneaking back to the Battle of Hogwarts when he's not supposed to be there and becoming one of the gut punches that dies in the battle? Yeah, it's rough. That's a rough foreshadow. Sorry for bringing that one up. 3, mandrakes. These are baby-sized seed planted. Puns all over the place. And explained as they will be used in the restoration of the kids who get petrified later in this book. The mandrakes cure them, so now we had to learn somewhere that mandrakes can cure people who are cursed or perhaps petrified. And it happened here. Sure. 4, pretty much Lockhart this whole chapter, but we're going to say the Cornish pixie thing is a blatant foreshadow that this guy is completely useless. And Ron's comment about what he says he's done is a bit on the nose, but completely accurate. He's a fraud, and even Ron can tell. And he's 12 years old. We, of course, later learn that he's exactly right. Now, let's give away some
House points.
In true Hogwarts fashion, these points are completely subjective with no oversight and fully at my discretion. This week, I'm giving house points to Ron, who's getting 15 for recognizing that Lockhart is a fraud, even before Hermione does. Ron doesn't get things particularly perceptually or intellectually or pretty much anything ever before Hermione does. So kudos to him on this one. Now I'm going to take some points away from Draco, who's losing 5 for being a bully. Hermione is also losing 5 for her ridiculous crush on Lockhart. Even at 12, it's not in character. At all. And Lockhart, he's losing 50 for being a total douchebag for the absolute entirety of this chapter. Front to back douching. Now that's an image. I'm going to add these to my nerdy-ass spreadsheet the moment that I actually create it. But I promise I will have it ready to tally them up for the end of this season's Bingy Awards. Before we go, I have to acknowledge the moments in this episode that were utterly
Ridiculous.
It's not an episode of The Binge if we don't call out what didn't make any sense. Starting with, I've said this before, I'll say it again, differently this time. Gilderoy Lockhart's existence in this series is ridiculous, but specifically how he treats Harry in this chapter is particularly vomit-inducing. To me, he's clearly riding the coattails of a famous student and not in the Slughorn way. He wants to shine brighter than the boy who lived, and he's both trying to gain the attention Harry gets while also subduing Harry and slapping his hand about seeking it. All the while, we know that Harry gets the attention he doesn't want, and Lockhart wants nothing more. And that whole dynamic I get it, I understand, I just don't dig it. and I find it a bit ridiculous that it even exists. Also, Hermione being unable to see past her little crush to see that Lockhart's full of shit before Ron does is ridiculous. I just said this. It's the only instance I can think of from the entire series that she lets who is doing something impact her ability to judge the what that person is doing. And I realize as a sentence in the English language that might not have made a lot of sense, but let me rephrase it another way. If there was a teacher who came to the school who was treating other teachers poorly, trying to elevate themselves above everyone else around them, and trying to use students for getting attention for themselves, as well as making a self-centered educational course, which Hermione clings to her books like a life force. She literally only cares about her education and learning, and the idea that somebody came in and just made the course all about them rather than the subject they were supposed to be teaching. Say that anyone else did that. Say Quirrell did it. Imagine Umbridge had done that when she was the teacher of Defense Against the Dark. Hermione would have been on this shit in a second. But because Lockhart's good looking, she's completely oblivious, apparently. And I don't know, I find that pretty ridiculous. With that, we've reached the end of this episode of The Binge. As always, shout out to producer Jack, who I work like a dog. Remember to follow and subscribe to the show on whatever podcast player you're using, and if it supports a rating and review option, please leave one. If you're so inclined, check out the additional benefits available on patreon.com/belatedbinge. I've worked hard on those, and I'd really like somebody to take advantage of them. If you're reading along, next episode, we're covering Chapter 7 of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Mudbloods and Murmurs, and I'm just going to tell you, it's a heavy one. Until then, I'll see you next time on the Belated Binge Podcast. Can you believe him? Roared Ron as one of the remaining pixies bit him painfully on the ear. He just wants to give us some hands-on experience, said Hermione, immobilizing two pixies at once with a clever freezing charm and stuffing them back into their cage. Hands-on? Said Harry, who was trying to grab a pixie dancing out of reach with its tongue out. Hermione, he didn't have a clue what he was doing. Rubbish, said Hermione. You've read his books. Look at all those amazing things he's done. He says he's done, Ron muttered.